In society, science and sports, performance-enhancing drugs.
Most of what goes on in sport goes on off the playing field.
It's about what you have on them in order to protect yourself.
I was first raped violently.
Well, you're finished. You'll never play football again.
Obviously, shoe contracts worth $400,000 or $500,000.
Morals and ethics don't exist above and beyond the society that they're a part of.
Nowadays, kids are faced with the choice of do you want a couple of $1 million or your college degree?
Sport is a metaphor for what goes on in the real world.
Science and technology applied to sports propels individual performance to new heights. Advances in equipment and training are linked to breakthroughs in our understanding of performance physiology, resulting in stronger, faster, quicker, more accurate performance in individual and team sports. Athletes with access to new technology or new training methods often prosper in sports. New boat keels, new bicycle designs, new pole vaulting poles, and new apparel materials are examples of external technological improvements permitted in sports, which result in advantages to those who employ them. But what about drugs? When does a medication become an unfair advantage over a competitor? Or what level of health risk should be permitted in the medical support for improved performance? These issues were discussed at the Summit on Sports Ethics. So let's return to the summit to first identify some of the issues in managing performance-enhancing drugs, and then we will explore some of the ethical and philosophical aspects of this societal challenge.
Doping has been around for thousands of years, back to the Greeks in the first pre-Olympic Games, to the explosion in the 60s and 70s with the Russian and Eastern Bloc athletes beginning dope control. I've had a number of very interesting experiences during that time period. Dr. John Ziegler, who was the team physician for the American weightlifting team back in the 50s and 60s. And remember, this was a different time period. This is a time period of the Eastern Bloc and the Russian Iron Curtain and the American Pride and so on. And so when he saw the Eastern Bloc or Russian athletes using steroids, he saw this as an affront to America's dominance. But when you had people like Paul Anderson, who would just literally cause a sphincter reflex when the other athletes would see him because he was so massive and strong, Ziegler was concerned about our American power base because we had a different mindset then. So he came back to the U.S. and began designing similar drugs with Ciba-Geigy, which was the original Dianabol methandrostenolone, which the athletes in the 60s and 70s began to use, and realized at that time they were giving anabolic steroids in college studies at universities to athletes as part of the research. I mean, there was no ban against these drugs. There was no official testing procedures. Donica had not yet invented the IOC testing procedures to detect anabolic steroids. So there was no way to even detect. It's like before cardiology, before stethoscope, you didn't really know if anybody's heart was really working properly because you didn't have the instrumentation to test for it. And over time, we began to see these changes. So back in the early 80s, I began to do this survey that I do every few years, and it's always kind of odd to see that athletes are willing to literally do anything to win at a particular sport. And this survey is quite simple. I ask a simple question to world-class athletes in a number of different sporting areas, and I say, if I had a magic pill, you only need to take it once, but you win everything for the next 5 years, would you take it? Oh, one small catch, it'll kill you at the end of the 5-year period. 52% said yes. And this is consistent, about 50% say yes. So if you have a 16-year-old that says, I'll die when I'm 21 to win an Olympic gold medal, an NFL, an NBA championship, or so on, you have a particular mindset that you really must address. And now that you have these enormous earning capabilities of athletes and the adulation, and you can dye your hair 50 colors and you're a hot character and everybody likes you, you can do almost anything and get away with it and still be a hero. So we have a warped view of what children should want to look up to and how far they're really willing to go in order to do this. And this is a frightening situation.
Well, a very simple thing is why is it wrong for the Chinese women's swim team to use consistently performance-enhancing drugs, testosterone, whatever they're using, and right for 50% of the United States Olympic swim team to be declared asthmatics so they can use inhalers which you get ephedrine hits off of? Balance that out for me. So that's some of the debate that we're dealing with here. Bob Goldman mentioned that he's involved worldwide with the issue of drug testing, and I wrote a column off of that conference in LA for Sport Magazine, and it dealt with, I was stunned because I keep hearing from leagues like the NFL and the NCAA that this problem, if not solved, is at least under control, and I'll give you a couple of examples. I called the NCAA and I said, well, tell me what your percentage of athletes who test positive for steroids are. 1 to 2%. And they test 18 players at bowl games per team. They random drug test in Division I football, in Division I track and field. And I called the NFL and I said, well, give me your number, or the number of athletes in the NFL that have tested positive for steroids in the last 3 years. And there have been 1,700 players a year that have gone through that league, about 5,100 players. Any idea, anybody have any idea how many? 6. That's 1.2%. Now, as Bob will say and Rob will say, if you're using creatine or Ovaltine or whatever you want to say, there's on God's good green astroturf, there's no way in the world, I don't believe, and certainly after leaving that conference where they talked about the drug use in elite sport at quote-unquote epidemic proportions, that 1.2% of athletes that are 6'6", 290 pounds and run at warp speed are not using some performance-enhancing drug. Whether it's, and I wrote these down because they sort of HGH, IGF-1, DHEA, GHB, EPO, all genetic synthetic hormones that are undetectable by machine at this point in time. So that's the drug debate.
And when asked the question if research would conclusively show that these drugs have lethal effects, over 70% of them said they would not take those substances. So I wanted to ask you, in terms of how you do your survey and who you talk to, and why it is perhaps so we might not be able to corroborate, or are the athletes lying to us, or is there some way to figure this out?
Well, even a 30% death rate is still pretty significant. What I tend to do is I tend to look for people who are at world level who are really very, very hardcore. I mean, a lot of the powerlifters are hardcore, but maybe part of their cortex is still intact. I guess I may be dealing with those who've lost a good bit more gray matter than the others. But I think it's also the hypotheticalness of the question. You know, you say somebody, this could happen, but in their minds they're saying, well, yeah, it could, but I'm still focused on the goal. I still want to win. I'll do anything to win. I mean, how many times do you hear a kid saying, I'll do anything if I could have that brand new toy? So I think part of the higher value may be attributed to the fact that it is a hypothetical question. I'm sure if somebody had a gun at their head and said, if you take this pill, I'm going to kill you right after you win your championship, or a mafia situation, you're going to die right after it, there'd be more finality in there, and I think maybe the percentage would go down. But even a 25 or a 30, even a 10% level for people who are so in tune with their bodies and so consider their body their most valuable asset. Rob brought up a good point in terms of the use for cosmetic use, that a good portion, 30, 40, 50% of the kids are taking it to look better, so they can get girls or boys or whatever their interest is, and be attractive.
I think money plays a big role. The IOC is a big franchise. The NFL is a billion-dollar franchise. The NFL, when they decide what to do about anabolic steroids, it's clear if you want to prevent anabolic steroids, you've got to do research, you've got to do honest education. The NFL is in the perfect position to do research. We've got very exact medical records on all these people. We can follow up positions that used, that didn't use. The ex-players are incredibly honest. They're worried, the guys that used to take it. We have the data sitting right there. The NFL won't do it. Why? Right. It's not in their best interest. That could damage this multi-billion-dollar franchise. Same thing with all these other BS rulings on gambling and other things. That's all. They want to make the sport clean for people watching at home, for the bettors, for people that are making it worth the value that it is to the current owners. And so I hate to be cynical, but I think money in the Olympic franchise, and certainly the NFL, and certainly other professional organizations.
We have physiologic use, but then we have the whole philosophical abuse factor. So now there's a lot of confusion because we have 76 million baby boomers who want to start taking these hormone replacements, Viagra Plus, And then over here we have this abuse situation in our athletes, which we're desperately trying to avert. And then you have athletes willing to do anything to cheat or get by the test. One of my first dope controls, actually, I was doing with Professor Donik at the time, was 1986 in Japan. And I get called into the room because one of the athletes had the sample was cool like water, and there were oil droplets floating on top. And I go, what's going on with this athlete? So we go in the back, and Donica, being German, says, rip off all the clothes. And these two Japanese sumo wrestlers, who they gave us as a dope control watchers in the bathroom, could you imagine going to a Japanese bathroom, which is the size of a closet, and having these 290-pound guys behind you pushing on your butt while you're trying to pee? I mean, who could pee with these guys? Who could pee? So we hear screams from the bathroom. As we were laughing, we really enjoyed that dope control. It was a lot of fun. And they give us a sample. We have the athlete disrobe, and they literally rip his clothes off, and we reach down between his bathing suit, and he had a bottle of suntan oil, which he had filled with water to put between his legs, so he squeezed his legs together, the water would squirt out. But he forgot to rinse the bottle out. So another Rhodes Scholar we had to disqualify. So that's always a problem. So basically what we're dealing with is 2 functioning neurons and 1 synapse a month. And we recently had a few tragedies in our sport, as in others, and the comment in closing, just to give you an idea, one of our athletes died right in front of his other athletes. He was 31 years old, and they saw him going into full cardiac arrest, vomiting on himself, choking, and just dying in front of them. And the comment from one of his closest friends, who was also a competitor, said, well, at least he won. So how do you solve this? Very difficult.
There are serious management challenges in the current system of regulation of performance-enhancing drugs. Within individual sports, between different nations, and among the various levels of medical technology for the detection of drugs, enforcement of regulations is difficult. Dr. Bob Goldman shared his international experience illustrating the worldwide management and enforcement problems presented by the lengths to which athletes will go to achieve a competitive edge, often without concern for their own long-term health and safety. Armin Katayan noted how the medical profession reports that there are problems of epidemic proportion in the use of potentially dangerous performance-enhancing drugs, while the leagues and management associations often claim that everything is under control and the violations are rare. Dr. Rob Huizinga noted how doctors can help athletes pass the test for performance-enhancing drugs, and he focuses on the need for medical research into the effects of the drugs which are now commonly used. The uncertainties regarding ethical and philosophical distinctions are an important part of the management problem in performance-enhancing drugs. How do you distinguish between the good and the bad drugs? And who should say what medical risk athletes should take?
Now, where does that leave us in terms of the issue of performance-enhancing drugs? Well, despite the fact that none of us are pure paternalists or pure libertarians, the line that marks off the paternalists and libertarians in the case of performance-enhancing drugs is a fairly clear one. Paternalists are convinced that using performance-enhancing drugs harms people. It can, in fact, kill people. And so their argument in this particular case is we're acting in the best interest of athletes and we can intervene in their liberty. On the libertarian side, the argument is very strong that we have good reason to doubt that the paternalist case is a very persuasive one for a couple of reasons. The first reason being there's too many things that are currently allowed in sports. Too many kinds of substances, analgesic drugs, for example, pain-killing drugs, which can be very harmful. There are too many specialized diets and the like that we know can depress the immune system, and training regimens and the like. So, and there are a number of activities that are allowed in sports today. For example, there are no weight classifications in football. Well, that's a harmful practice. Some sports, in fact, the luge, winter sport in the Winter Olympics, the sled, skydiving, rock climbing, and the like, are sports that are predicated on risk. So in these particular cases, okay, I lost my train of thought just for a second. Okay, well, I was talking the case against Tony. Okay, so we have good reason to doubt that this argument from harm is persuasive, because there's just simply too many things that athletes engage in that are already legal that compromise their health. Bertolt Brecht had a great line. He said, "Great sport begins where good health ends." So the connection between elite sports and health is a very tenuous connection, to say the least. The other problem with the paternalist position, of course, is the threat to liberty that we mentioned before. Are we really prepared to say that adult athletes who know full well the risks of these substances are forbidden to take them? And if we are, then are we prepared to say to adult citizens that they are forbidden to smoke, or to drink excessively in the privacy of their own homes, or to eat high-fat foods? I doubt any of us would stake out such a strong paternalist claim, precisely because we value liberty. And the same argument ought to apply to adult athletes who are competent and know the risks involved.
I want to argue that, in fact, those medical questions are actually irrelevant, because the issue here is what we all do. You see, it's only the question of whether or not anabolic steroids works only affects competition if you dope and I don't dope. If we both dope, doesn't matter. If we both agree not to dope, it doesn't matter. See, the thing about performance-enhancing substances is they only provide a competitive edge if some people don't do it. So the fundamental question is, why go that route at all? You can jack the level up for everybody. So if everybody's doping, you might get faster sport in general for everybody, but it doesn't give any particular individual a competitive advantage. So the rational, prudent athlete might say, we don't need to go here. We can actually have a really interesting game down here. As long as everybody's competing at the same level, it doesn't matter.
I would argue that it does matter, because what you're talking about cannot be made practical in today's world. You have a huge amount of money and prestige, and you have drugs that can get people closer to that. Since testing is very difficult, and since detection is very difficult, we have a practical problem. And the only way we can address that practical problem is to convince people not to use it. All these detection means, I think, are hubbub.
In the case of young people, not only is paternalism morally permissible, it's morally obligatory. We're talking about young people who do not have the repertoire of experience and often don't think of the long-term consequences of their action to think rationally about what they're doing. So in those cases, again, it's not just permissible to assume a paternalist stance, you're morally obligated. And in the case of youth sports, they ought to stand for certain kinds of fundamental values, fair play, honesty, sense of self-determination. And in those cases, performance-enhancing drugs clearly are not allowed. So that would be certainly one limitation one would make on that argument. The other limitation that would apply to adult athletes are the use of pain-killing drugs. My experience has been, and from talking to people who work in these fields, in many cases athletes are not fully informed of how these drugs are being administered, whether in fact they're being administered, and are clearly not aware of the long-term consequences of and the risk associated with those drugs. It's perfectly compatible with a view that stresses liberty to argue in these kinds of cases some sort of paternalist intervention is called for. What kind? Probably not a ban, but certainly strong procedural rules which would make it very clear that these drugs are being administered and what the long-term consequences and short-term consequences are and what the risk would be involved. Then I think we can say that on this argument we would turn it back to the agent themselves. And if under those circumstances they're fully apprised of the risk, then under those circumstances one would have to defer to liberty. And of course deferring to liberty doesn't necessarily mean praising the way in which people act. We may have problems with the way they're acting, but it does in fact mean tolerating and respecting their individual liberty to live their lives, again, provided no one else is being harmed.
Our ability to define the natural in some useful kind of way in this context, it seems to me, is extremely limited. Among the kinds of efforts athletes have made to enhance their performance is to use substances from their own bodies, for example. Nothing more natural than one's own blood. It may not be natural to be able to take it out of your body and to reinfuse it, but it's certainly a natural substance. Testosterone, a perfectly natural substance. Foodstuffs, which are perfectly natural. They may even be organically grown, which contain various kinds of chemicals which are enhancing in performance are certainly available, and all kinds of food. On the other hand, you can look at some of the kinds of enhancement techniques that athletes use now, which are perfectly allowed, which are not very natural. I mean, we use, for example, equipment. There's nothing more unnatural in the sense it's not part of the normal human body to use various sorts of equipment to enhance your performance. It might be argued that athletes which do something which is not part of the norm, the natural sort of training process which they are engaged in or which their society engages in, are doing something very unnatural. Long-distance runners crave running in high altitudes, again, to enhance the production of red blood cells and hence the oxygen carrying capacity of their blood. Is that natural or not? Well, it's hard to say. And as a consequence, it seems to me that you can't make a decision about the use of drugs by arguing that they are unnatural, but have to base that decision on some other kinds of grounds. And those other kinds of grounds lead us back once again into questions about the autonomy and the choice of athletes and the kinds of sports that we want to watch and what it is about enhancing performance that we find so threatening. And if it's not health per se, since athletics are full of risk in any case, if it's not the natural as such, since there are many varieties of the natural and unnatural in any given social context, then what is it? And this leaves, it seems to me, the argument in a kind of puzzling sort of situation. Either it's because people in a kind of knee-jerk way simply say, oh, drugs are bad, and that's where the argument ends, or they're now forced to look at the use of enhancing athletic performance in some really new way. And that becomes very difficult to do. And at this point, it raises some very interesting questions about human nature, about our capacity to influence and change the nature of our own behavior. And I think it now begins to lead us into some very profound issues of modern medical technology, the prospects of transforming ourselves in the light of our own self-images. This is true in a somewhat superficial way in the case of using performance-enhancing substances, whatever they may be. It will be profoundly true to the extent that we can, in the future, begin to control our own genetic inheritance. So it now will force people to look at what we are as humans and to ask some questions about what we could be. And this raises very deep and important, deep fears and very important questions, which I think philosophers are only beginning to explore. So that's where that's where it leads us, and I think that's why, you know, in a curious sort of way, the superficiality of the debate on drugs, if pushed and if allowed to open up and to flourish as a really interesting sort of philosophical debate, leads us into some questions which are far more profound and far more interesting than whether or not Ben Johnson used steroids.
The ethical and philosophical issues are not easy to resolve, but these fundamental conflicts regarding definitions, rights, and responsibilities result in the management problems cited by Drs. Goldman, Huizinga, and Armen-Keteyian. Professor Miller-Brown explored the difficulties in drawing the line between the natural and the unnatural or artificial means used in enhancing performance. He showed the futility of using the natural-unnatural distinction in distinguishing ethical choices. Professor William Morgan characterized two dominant approaches to the issue of performance-enhancing drugs: the paternalistic approach, where those who are in responsible positions make decisions for others, and the libertarian approach, where athletes are free to make their own choices regarding their own well-being and use of performance-enhancing drugs. Dr. Robert Butcher made the point that as long as everyone does a particular practice, then it preserves the fairness of competition. So he encourages the uniformity of application over the specific question as what should be banned. The practical managerial problems in our present ways of handling performance-enhancing drugs results from technological and social realities which make the control of these substances next to impossible. As the rewards continue to increase for obtaining an advantage over competitors, some athletes will put their health, indeed their own lives, at risk. What would the best society do? Would it permit its athletes to make their own choice, or would it make the choice for them? And in either case, we must commit to developing a fair management and enforcement system that makes the options work in the world of sport.